Hi Vogue, it's Kim Kardashian West, and today I'm going to be going through some of my most iconic looks.
Generally, I try not to talk about like other brands if I didn't like a particular ice cream.
What's your favorite word?
My favorite word is hydration.
Really?
I'm Glenn Close.
And I'm Kim Kardashian.
Walking away sounds simple until the spotlight becomes the place where your identity lives. For Kim Kardashian, fame was never just attention. It became structure, validation, direction, a mirror that reflected who she was supposed to be. And once that mirror exists, stepping away doesn't feel like rest. It feels like erasure. From the outside, it looks like obsession. Endless appearances, constant reinvention, a presence so persistent it feels intentional. People ask why she doesn't disappear for a while, why she doesn't fade quietly into the wealth she's already secured. But that question misunderstands the psychology of visibility, because when your rise is built on being seen, invisibility doesn't feel peaceful. It feels dangerous. Silence doesn't feel calm. It feels like losing relevance. And relevance over time stops being a luxury and starts feeling like oxygen. Kim didn't just adapt to the spotlight. She learned how to survive inside it. This isn't the story of a woman who loves attention. It's the story of what happens when attention becomes the foundation of your sense of self, and why leaving the spotlight is harder than staying in it. Kim Kardashian didn't fall into fame by accident, but she also didn't enter it with a roadmap for how to leave. Her rise happened in a space where visibility wasn't a side effect of success. It was the success. Being seen created relevance. Relevance created opportunity. Opportunity created power. And once that cycle began, stepping out of it was never part of the design. From early on, attention wasn't just something she received, it was something she learned to manage, shape, and eventually control. Every appearance, every controversy, every reinvention added another layer to the same structure. Visibility equals value. That lesson embeds itself deeply. When attention consistently leads to progress, the brain starts associating exposure with safety. Silence, then, doesn't feel neutral. It feels like loss, like regression, like slipping backward in a world that only rewards forward motion. This is where the psychology shifts. Most people imagine the spotlight as something external. Bright lights, cameras, headlines. For Kim, it became internal. A feedback system, a way to measure momentum. When the attention was high, everything felt aligned. When it dipped, something felt wrong, even if nothing objectively was. And that's how dependency forms, not on fame itself, but on the sense of being relevant. Relevance is addictive because it feels like proof of existence. Proof that you matter right now, not just historically. And in Kim's world, relevance was never static. It had to be maintained, refreshed, defended. There was always a new standard, a new expectation, a new version of herself to present. Reinvention became survival. But reinvention has a hidden cost. When you're constantly becoming someone new for public consumption, continuity of self starts to blur. The line between who you are and who you present gets thinner. Eventually, the presentation takes priority because that's what gets rewarded. Kim learned early that retreat creates vacuum, and vacuums get filled by other people's narratives. Silence invites speculation. Absence invites replacement. In a culture that moves fast and forgets faster, disappearing doesn't feel like rest. It feels like surrendering control. So she stayed visible, not necessarily because she wanted more fame, but because visibility meant authorship. As long as she was present, she could shape the story, decide the angle, choose the timing. Visibility became a way to stay ahead of judgment rather than under it. That's not vanity, that's strategy. But strategy, when practiced long enough, becomes instinct. And instinct doesn't turn off easily. Over time, the spotlight stopped being something Kim stepped into. It became something she lived inside. Decisions weren't just personal, they were contextual. How would this land? How would this be read? What would this do to the narrative? When your life is filtered this way, privacy stops feeling like a right. It starts feeling like a risk, because privacy removes feedback, And without feedback, there's uncertainty. Am I still relevant? Am I still valued? Am I still needed? Those questions don't come from insecurity alone. They come from conditioning. Kim's entire adult life reinforced one idea: staying visible keeps you powerful. And power, once tasted, is hard to relinquish. Not because of ego, but because power provides predictability, control, leverage. Walking away would mean letting go of those tools. The public often frames this as an inability to let go. But letting go assumes there's something waiting on the other side. For someone whose identity, influence, and rhythm are all tied to visibility, the other side feels undefined. And humans avoid undefined spaces, especially when they've learned how to dominate a defined one. So the spotlight becomes familiar, heavy but familiar. There's also another layer people ignore: responsibility. When you become a cultural constant, people build expectations around you. Media cycles rely on your presence. Brands align themselves with your visibility. Teams depend on your momentum. Stepping away doesn't just affect you, it disrupts an ecosystem. That pressure is subtle but real. It tells you that slowing down isn't just personal, it's selfish. That absence would let people down. That staying visible is part of the job, even if no one explicitly says it. And over time, the job replaces the self. Kim's persistence in the spotlight isn't about craving attention. It's about maintaining coherence in a life built on visibility. It's about staying inside a system she understands rather than stepping into uncertainty. Because uncertainty feels far scarier than exhaustion. And this is the part most people miss. The spotlight doesn't just shine outward, it shines inward. It becomes a mirror you learn to read yourself through. When that mirror disappears, you're left alone with questions that fame has kept busy. Who am I without the reaction? Who am I when no one is watching? Do I still exist in the same way? Those questions are heavy, and answering them requires stillness, something Kim's world rarely allows. So she stays present. She stays visible. She stays in motion. Not because she can't quit, but because quitting would mean facing a silence she's never been taught how to trust. And that's only the beginning of why the spotlight still holds her. As the years passed, the spotlight stopped feeling like a phase and started feeling like permanence. For Kim Kardashian, fame wasn't something she could outgrow. It was something that grew with her, shaping each stage of adulthood along the way. What began as visibility slowly turned into structure. When your life unfolds publicly, milestones don't belong to you alone. Relationships, marriages, divorces, motherhood, reinvention, each moment becomes shared property. Not just observed, but processed collectively. The public doesn't just watch change, it participates in it. And once that dynamic is established, leaving the spotlight doesn't feel like stepping away from attention. It feels like abandoning a conversation that never stopped talking about you. This is where attachment deepens. Kim didn't just become famous. She became familiar, predictable in presence, if not in form. The audience learned to expect her. Media cycles built around her consistency. She wasn't just reacting to attention anymore. She was anchoring it. Anchors are hard to lift because being an anchor gives you influence. When you're central, you don't just respond to culture, you guide it. Fashion shifts, beauty standards, language, controversy. Her visibility shaped taste, debate, and direction. And influence, once internalized, becomes part of how you measure effectiveness. If I'm seen, I'm shaping something. If I'm silent, someone else is. That belief doesn't come from ego, it comes from repetition. Years of evidence reinforcing the same pattern, and patterns rewire instinct. Another reason the spotlight is hard to quit is control. Kim learned that staying present gave her the ability to redirect narratives in real time. Silence, on the other hand, invited interpretation. Others filled in the blanks. Rumors hardened into assumptions. Absence didn't reduce noise, it amplified it. So presence became protection. This is where people misunderstand the constant visibility. They assume it's performative. But in many cases, it's defensive. Being visible allows you to intervene, to clarify, to counterbalance, to stay ahead of conclusions rather than buried beneath them. The cost of that control, though, is constant engagement. There's no true off switch when your relevance depends on responsiveness. Even reinvention must be visible to count. Growth has to be witnessed to be validated. Personal evolution becomes public narrative. And when growth becomes narrative, it loses privacy. Kim's ability to adapt is often praised, but adaptation under observation is different from adaptation in solitude. When you evolve privately, mistakes are temporary. When you evolve publicly, mistakes are permanent records, screenshots, clips, timelines. That reality makes stepping away feel risky. What if the version of you that returns isn't accepted? What if the audience moved on? What if relevance doesn't wait? These fears aren't irrational in a culture that rewards novelty. Longevity requires maintenance, and maintenance requires presence. There's also the matter of identity continuity. When so much of your self-concept has been shaped through external response, internal silence feels unfamiliar. Without feedback, orientation is lost. You don't disappear, but the markers that tell you where you stand do. That loss of orientation can feel destabilizing, so staying visible becomes grounding. It gives you rhythm, structure, feedback loops, a sense of progression. Without it, time stretches differently, days feel unmarked, accomplishments feel less concrete. Most people anchor identity in private roles: family member, friend, partner. Kim's identity, while containing those roles, has always been reinforced publicly. Applause, criticism, relevance, these became signals of existence in a fast-moving world. Removing those signals abruptly isn't restful, it's disorienting. There's also an emotional reality people ignore. Stepping away would require grieving the version of yourself that existed because of the spotlight, the ambition, the adrenaline, the certainty of direction. Letting go of attention isn't just losing visibility, it's losing a relationship that's been constant for decades, and endings, even healthy ones, are painful. Kim's presence in the spotlight isn't about being unable to stop. It's about not having a clear emotional model for what life looks like after stopping. Fame arrived before alternatives formed. Visibility came before inner stillness was practiced. So she continues, refines, rebrands, repositions, not because she's empty without attention, but because attention has been the language through which her life has moved forward. Changing that language requires time, safety, and permission to be irrelevant for a while. And irrelevance in her world has always been framed as failure. That framing is powerful. It convinces you that rest equals retreat, that silence equals decline, that absence equals loss. So even when exhaustion creeps in, the instinct is not to withdraw, but to adjust, to find a new angle, a new project, a new role that keeps the spotlight alive while making it feel productive. This is why reinvention repeats. Each new chapter promises balance, maturity, control. But the underlying engine stays the same: visibility as reassurance, presence as proof of continuity. Walking away would mean trusting that worth exists without witness. And for someone whose entire adult life has been shaped by being seen, that trust doesn't come easily. Not because she lacks depth, but because depth was never allowed to exist without an audience. So the spotlight remains, not as a craving, but as a constant reference point, a familiar weight, a known terrain. And until there's a quieter place that feels just as solid, leaving it behind will always feel like stepping into something undefined, which is far more frightening than staying where you already know how to survive. By this stage, the spotlight is no longer something external. It's internalized. It shapes instinct before logic ever gets involved. For Kim Kardashian, visibility isn't a phase of life she can step in and out of. It's the environment in which her sense of momentum, relevance, and identity learned how to function. This is where the psychology deepens, because when you live long enough inside attention, attention stops feeling optional. It becomes the context through which decisions are made, not consciously, reflexively. You don't ask, "Do I want to be seen?" You ask, "How should I be seen this time?" That subtle shift changes everything. It means even withdrawal has to be strategic. Even privacy has to be framed. Even silence has to be explained. True disappearance, quiet, unannounced, undefined, feels impossible because it breaks the rules of a system that has rewarded presence for decades, and systems resist being abandoned. Another layer people underestimate is how deeply the spotlight becomes tied to self-worth, not in a shallow way, but in a structural one. When feedback has always been external, internal validation doesn't fully develop on its own. Praise, criticism, relevance, controversy, these become emotional markers. They tell you where you stand. Without them, there's ambiguity. And ambiguity is uncomfortable when you've been trained to operate in certainty. Kim's life has rarely been ambiguous. It has been fast, documented, reactive. There's always been a next move, a next project, a next narrative. That forward motion creates a sense of control. Even chaos feels manageable when it's visible and active. Stillness, by contrast, feels like loss of agency. This is why stepping away isn't restful. It's threatening, because rest requires surrendering control over how you're perceived. It means letting the story continue without you shaping it in real time. And for someone who learned early that control equals safety, that surrender feels dangerous. The public often frames this as fear of obscurity, but it's not obscurity that's frightening. It's being misunderstood without the ability to respond. It's losing the power to correct the narrative, to contextualize, to reframe. Presence equals authorship. Absence equals interpretation. And interpretation has rarely been kind. Kim learned that the hard way. Silence never softened scrutiny. It intensified it. Gaps invited speculation. Distance invited distortion. So engagement became a form of self-defense. Staying visible meant staying legible. That habit doesn't disappear just because wealth increases. In fact, wealth complicates it further, because now visibility isn't just personal, it's economic. Brands, businesses, platforms, partnerships all rely on sustained attention. The spotlight isn't just following her, it's fueling systems that extend beyond her individual needs. Stepping away doesn't just affect identity, it affects infrastructure. That creates pressure most people never experience. It tells you that disappearing isn't just personal, it's disruptive. That rest isn't just self-care, it's risk. And when responsibility is framed that way, endurance starts to feel virtuous. You keep going, not because you want more, but because stopping feels like letting something fall apart. This is how the spotlight becomes sticky, not through ego, but through obligation. There's also the emotional reality of comparison, not with others, but with past versions of yourself. The internet preserves every era, every look, every peak of relevance. And when people tell you that you were better before, it creates a strange kind of grief. You're still here, still growing, still evolving. But the world is nostalgic for a version of you that no longer exists. That tension is heavy. It makes you question whether growth is worth the cost, whether becoming quieter, more grounded, more private will be interpreted as decline rather than maturity. And when interpretation leans negative, the instinct is to reassert presence, to remind people you're still here. So visibility becomes reassurance, not just to the audience, but to yourself. Another overlooked aspect is how the spotlight simplifies emotion. Public narratives prefer clarity, strong or weak, confident or insecure, winning or failing. But real inner life is messy, contradictory, unresolved. When you live publicly, complexity gets flattened. You learn to present digestible versions of yourself because nuance doesn't travel well at scale. But presenting simplified versions over time can make it harder to stay connected to the fuller, messier internal self. That's when exhaustion creeps in. Not physical exhaustion, but existential fatigue. The tiredness that comes from always being legible, always being on, always being interpretable. And yet, despite that fatigue, the idea of leaving still doesn't feel right. Because leaving would require trusting that life has meaning without constant reaction. That purpose exists without audience. That identity can survive without reinforcement. That trust is difficult to build when reinforcement has always been abundant. So Kim stays in the spotlight, but she adjusts how she stands in it. More controlled, more selective, less reactive. It's not the same visibility as before. It's curated endurance. This is not failure to evolve. It is evolution within constraints. She's not chasing chaos. She's managing exposure, finding ways to remain present without being consumed. That balance isn't perfect. It's negotiated daily, and it requires constant self-monitoring. The spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it disciplines. It teaches you what works and what doesn't, what's rewarded and what's punished. Over time, those lessons become internal rules. And breaking internal rules feels dangerous, even when external circumstances have changed. That's why quitting the spotlight isn't just a career decision. It's a psychological one. It means unlearning years of conditioning, rebuilding identity without immediate feedback, accepting that worth doesn't have to be visible to be real. Those shifts don't happen suddenly. They happen slowly, with hesitation, with experimentation, and often while still standing in the light, because stepping fully into the dark feels like too much, too fast. So the spotlight remains, not because she can't leave, but because leaving requires a different kind of strength than staying. And that strength isn't developed under cameras. It's developed in silence. Eventually, the question stops being why she stays and becomes what staying has taught her. Because by now, the spotlight isn't just a place Kim Kardashian stands in. It's a force she's learned to negotiate with. She no longer rushes toward it the way she once did. She shapes it, controls it, uses it with intention rather than hunger. But even this refined relationship doesn't mean freedom from it. It means coexistence. For Kim Kardashian, the spotlight has become both witness and weight. It's seen her worst moments and rewarded her strongest adaptations. It's given her power, leverage, and a voice, but it's also quietly set the terms of how she's allowed to change. That's the part most people miss. The spotlight doesn't just ask you to show up, it asks you to stay recognizable. Growth is welcome, but only if it doesn't disrupt the image people already understand. Maturity is praised, but only when it looks polished. Privacy is respected, but only in small doses. And whenever those boundaries are tested, resistance appears. So leaving the spotlight isn't a single decision. It's a gradual psychological untangling. It means learning to tolerate being less discussed, less reacted to, less interpreted. It means accepting that silence won't always be filled kindly and choosing it anyway. It means trusting that worth doesn't evaporate when attention does. That identity can exist without constant confirmation. That kind of trust is hard-earned, and it doesn't come from winning. It comes from slowing down enough to hear yourself think without an audience. Kim's persistence in the public eye isn't about fear of obscurity. It's about the reality that attention has been the organizing principle of her adult life. Removing it suddenly would be destabilizing. So instead of quitting, she's been redefining how she shows up. Less reactive, more contained, more deliberate. That's not regression, it's adaptation. The spotlight taught her how to survive visibility. But the next chapter, whenever it fully arrives, will require learning how to survive without it. And that lesson can't be rushed. It has to be chosen repeatedly, in small ways, against instincts built over decades. So maybe the real answer isn't that Kim can't quit the spotlight. It's that quitting isn't an exit, it's a transformation, one that demands patience, safety, and the courage to let the world move on without you for a while. And that's a far harder challenge than staying visible, because staying visible is familiar. Leaving requires faith. Faith that life still has structure without applause, that meaning still exists without metrics, that you are still whole, even when no one is watching. If this story changed how you think about fame, identity, and the hidden psychology of attention like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We explore the stories beneath the spotlight, the ones that don't shout but explain.